It's Shadow Talk, your weekly cybersecurity and threat intelligence podcast. Today, Digital Shadows team will go to town on ATM fraud, with 4 separate ATM stories making their headlines this week. We've got Bitcoin ATM malware advertised for sale on the dark web, flaws discovered in NCR ATM currency dispensers, an alert on an impending ATM Cashout campaign issued by the FBI, and how India's Cosmos Bank lost $13.5 million in cyber attacks after actors bypassed the internal switch system for ATM debit payments. All this to come today on Shadow Talk. Hello and welcome to Shadow Talk. I'm your host, Rafael Amado. Joining me this week, we have Strategic Intelligence Manager, Rose Bernard. Rose, how are you?
Hi, Raf. How are you doing this week?
Very good, very good. Now, this week's news has been dominated by stories of new ATM malware, we've got ATM thefts, and even a law enforcement warning of a large-scale ATM attack. Rose, is this all a coincidence? What's going on here?
Oh, gosh. That's a big question. And I'm not sure I have all of the answers. I'm sorry. I think that it's helpful to think about ATM malware as one of those endemic pieces of malware that we see, along with ransomware, along with now cryptocurrency miners that kind of exist, and then every now and then we see a spike in reporting about it, and suddenly it sounds like that's the only thing that's attacking us. So this was sparked in particular by news that on Friday the 10th, the FBI released a private alert to banks, and you mentioned this earlier, and they talked about a potential organised cybercrime heist called an ATM Cashout. And we don't have very many details because obviously we're not a bank, so there aren't very many in the public domain. But what the FBI stated was that thieves were going to use cloned ATM cards to make fraudulent withdrawals, and it was going to be a globally organised unlimited operation campaign. So essentially criminals attempting to amass millions of dollars within a few hours, and it was potentially associated with an unknown card issuer breach.
So I think we'd all benefit by going over what the typical techniques used in ATM fraud operations are. And you just mentioned it there, something called an unlimited attack or an unlimited cash-out operation. What is that exactly?
So an unlimited operation is essentially a dual-pronged attack that allows criminals to take out or to empty the ATM of cash. And usually there are all of these checks and balances in place on an ATM and on your card, which include how much money can be taken out of the ATM, how many withdrawals you as a bank customer can make on that card, and how much money you can withdraw on that card. And so an unlimited operation targets the card in the ATM because criminals will often use a fraudulent card to take out money, but it will also target the bank system or the network of the ATM in order to remove these tools. What that means is that as a cyber criminal, you can go up and use one card to take out as much money or to make as many transactions as you want, potentially emptying that ATM. Quite a lot of these attacks tend to happen at weekends, so after financial institutions close for business on Saturday, because obviously then they won't know about it. But yeah, it's often time-bound as well, so you coordinate it so somebody else doesn't come along and realise that they can empty out the ATM.
So essentially, intruders remove the fraud controls at the bank or the financial institution. They alter the withdrawal amounts or the daily limits on that, and then basically they're able to take out as much money as they physically can. Okay, great. And you mentioned their fraudulent cards. So specifically, what type of payment cards are malicious actors using here? Are they using stolen cards? Are they creating their own clone cards? How does that work exactly?
It's typically create fake bank cards by imprinting stolen credit card data on blank magnetic strip cards. And that's often because when you have a stolen credit card, you'll report it, so its use is limited. But what they'll do is they'll buy credit card data or find or breach a credit institution, get all that data, and then make their own cards.
And we've talked many times on this podcast before about the ease of acquiring stolen payment card information. So you've got more physical attacks such as ATM skimming, But then you've also got people simply buying stolen details online as well. So this can be in forums, in marketplaces where users sell payment card dumps. You've got specialist AVC sites, those are automated vending carts, which are dedicated to the sale of this type of data. And more recently, what we've seen is the shift towards messaging apps such as Telegram and Discord, where sellers are treating these like channels, similar to traditional marketplaces where you can connect with buyers and sell data dumps, in a lot of cases payment card data. All right, great. Now that we have a better understanding of these ATM fraud operations, what mitigation advice has the FBI provided in their reporting?
Well, what we think they've provided, or what's been reported to us, is that they've talked about the need for strong passwords. They've advised that banks patch their systems. And then there's also quite an interesting move or piece of advice towards two-factor authentication for a bank card, which would mean that you put in your card with a PIN, and then also you have a secondary token, or you use an app on your phone to verify that transaction. And that's something that we've seen increasingly with online banking. So we have those little token things to access our online bank accounts, but we haven't actually seen that used with chip and PIN cards yet. And that would be a very strong way of protecting against this kind of fraud.
Yeah, and I think a couple of other things to highlight would be separations of duties or dual authentication procedures for account balances and withdrawal increases. You mentioned two-factor authentication there as well. There's other mentions that organizations can probably look into as well in terms of application whitelisting to block any malware that might be executed, and general monitoring and auditing procedures looking at critical accounts for malicious or suspicious activity at least. All right, great. Thank you for that, Rose. So the second ATM story of the week broke only yesterday, with 2 incidents resulting in the theft of approximately $13.5 million from India's Cosmos Bank. Rose, what's the ATM connection here?
So India's Cosmos Bank had or suffered an attack or an incident, and it has been connected to the alert that the FBI put out on Friday, because we've seen some of the same techniques that they talked about used. So it was an unlimited operation. They also targeted the SWIFT systems in the bank. And they used an unidentified malware to bypass the ATM switch system. So essentially, the switch system in an ATM is the system that routes your card to your bank. So it's what allows us to use essentially any bank card in any ATM. It sends the information, and it also encrypts and decrypts that information, and then it sends back the information to the ATM from your bank about the amount of money you have in your account, the amount of money you can withdraw, and the amount of transactions that you can make. So these attackers essentially installed a proxy switch on the system, which allowed them to make unlimited withdrawals and to take out an unlimited amount of money in that time. So they essentially, between about, I think it's 3 p.m. and 10 p.m, they used money mules in about 28 different countries to take about $13.4 million. So it definitely fits all of the requirements of being an organised campaign and unlimited operation. Then we also know that on Monday, there were 3 fraudulent SWIFT transactions, which moved about $1.93 million from the bank in India to the account of a Hong Kong business, although we don't know to what extent that is a fraudulent account, a real account, complicit and not complicit. And it seems to fit the bill that this attack is the one the FBI were talking about, but we don't know whether it is. We don't know if it's the only one.
You mentioned SWIFT transfers there as well.
Yeah.
How different, from what we know from the information that we have, how different is this from some of the other SWIFT attacks that we've seen over the last few years?
Most SWIFT attacks tend to follow the same pattern because they involve targeting the bank's communication system with the SWIFT system. So it's not actually the targeting of the SWIFT, it's the exploiting of the bank's connection with it and then using it to conduct fraudulent transactions. We don't know about whether or how they got to the SWIFT communication system. I think it's reasonable to assume that if they were in the bank's network and able to install a proxy switch and the bank, all of their systems were connected, they could have accessed the communication system with SWIFT. There are news reports coming out saying that it must be North Korea, it must be Lazarus Group because it's a SWIFT attack. I think that's...
It's the usual suspects.
Yeah,
Whenever we hear
a
Swift,
big assumption to make without any technical details. So
let's rattle through the final 2 stories of the week. We've got Bitcoin ATM malware advertised for sale on the dark web, and flaws discovered in NCR ATM currency dispensers. Rose, I'll take the NCR flaws and you can tell us about the Bitcoin ATM malware. So, security researchers at the Black Hat Security Conference last week published findings on 2 vulnerabilities which affected the ATM currency dispenser manufacturer NCR. These flaws affected NCR S1 and S2 dispensers, so 2 different models. And they've been identified as, let me just get this right, CVE 2017-17668, and the other one is CVE 2018-5717. And the flaws here relate to the memory write mechanism on these models. Now what this means is that attackers can exploit and execute arbitrary code and then install firmware containing vulnerabilities that can be exploited. These can then be exploited to force the ATMs to dispense cash. What's significant here is that the attackers require physical access to the devices, minimizing the threat level in this instance. Also, NCR have been notified of this flaw and they did release patches in February 2018. Finally, there's been no indication that either of these vulnerabilities have been targeted in the wild as of yet. Nevertheless, organizations with these particular NCR models should check to ensure the correct patches have been applied. And for those of you that may have missed it, those CVEs were 2017-17668 and 2018-5717.
No one's going to remember those.
Well, I'm sure a quick Google and they'll be able to find it. All right then, Rose, tell me, Bitcoin ATM malware, that sounds a lot more interesting.
I think it is. I'm a big fan of this story because largely we think of Bitcoin as a virtual currency, and it is to the extent that it doesn't exist in real life, although there is the same argument to be made about any currency. But so Bitcoin, the idea of having a Bitcoin ATM is almost an oxymoron. But actually, Bitcoin ATMs are used to put money on an account or transfer money between your Bitcoin wallets rather than to take money out. So there aren't that many, which is potentially why we haven't seen so much Bitcoin malware, Bitcoin ATM malware springing up. But now they're becoming more prevalent. Attackers are pivoting to target these new ones. So on the dark web forum, an advert was found for a malware variant which was targeting these Bitcoin ATMs, and it claims to allow attackers to steal up to $6,750, which is probably connected to the fact that that's more or less around the value of a Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I suspect that it's to do with internal alerts, so the idea that if you have a transaction that is under 1 Bitcoin, it doesn't raise internal security alerts within that ATM access because the ATM connects to a cryptocurrency exchange rather than to a bank. We think that the malware being sold is quite valid because the guy selling it or the person selling it has very good reviews. They're offering a 24/7 Jabber support. They have all of these guides in all of these different languages, and it's on sale for about £25,000, dollars even, which is significant investment for anyone. How we think this happens is if you buy this malware, you apparently receive a ready-to-use card with wireless payment enabled as well as chip and pin technology. And what that suggests to us is that the card is a payment card. So when you insert it into the Bitcoin ATM, it triggers a malware or it triggers a vulnerability within the connection between the ATM and the cryptocurrency exchange, which allows you to credit the amount in dollars or in Bitcoin to that card. Like I say, malware targeting Bitcoin ATMs has been relatively limited, but we do think it's going to grow. And without much more technical details about that vulnerability or that malware, we can't really talk about how we would mitigate against it. I think one of the things about Bitcoin is, although it's becoming more and more ubiquitous, it's still almost seen as this Wild West. And it is almost, you know how when you play with Monopoly money, that's a bad example. You know how when you go overseas and you pay with money and you're like, this is not real money because it is overseas money. And I have no understanding of how this translates. I think you and I are very
different in our attitudes towards money. But yeah, carry on with your analogy.
I have no idea how much this translates. The amount of times I found myself in an airport.
When you don't know the exchange rate, you're probably more willing when you're on holiday to...
How much is that? Yeah. How much is
I get you there.
But there's this tendency, I think, to think of it a little like that. You don't really sort of half commit to cryptocurrency. You're either into it or you're not. And I think that a lot of attackers are going to be exploiting this as a lot of people who are not into Bitcoin start using these ATMs.
Yeah, and as we've said before, we've done research on it as well. As Bitcoin becomes more and more popular, cyber criminals see that. They see it as an opportunity, so they're going to try and target it, whether it's the actual financial value of the Bitcoin itself or the people using it as well, or the machines they're using it to mine. So I guess this example of Bitcoin ATM malware being peddled online is probably going to be one of many that we're going to be talking about over the next year. Okay, before I ask Rose for her takeaway for the week, a reminder that you can find new research from Digital Shadows on resources.digitalshadows.com. Now, given today's theme, I'd recommend having a read of our 5-part Threats to Financial Services series, which looks at insiders, banking trojans, phishing, hacktivism, yes, that's still an issue, and payment card fraud. Now, time for your takeaway, Rose. What do you have for our listeners?
My takeaway this week would actually be to not focus on ATM malware. I think that it's very tempting to get caught up in all of these headlines. And this week we're talking about this topic, next week we're talking about a different topic, but that doesn't mean that all the other threats go away. And actually, to have a really good cybersecurity strategy, you need to look at it from a horizontal rather than a vertical vector.
Of course, I think that's sage advice for all days of the year and all weeks. But I think given what's gone on this week, maybe organisations that do deal with ATM payments and ATM machines, probably just a good wake-up call to start monitoring and auditing in case you haven't been doing so before. I mean, from me, some tips for organisations looking to combat payment card fraud more generally and preventing these stolen payment card details ending up in the hands of groups and actors to perform ATM fraud and cash out operations. A few things to recommend would be benchmark yourself against peers. I mean, look which card providers fraudsters are actually recommending not to use, because if you go on forums, you can see which cards are the most sought after, and try and understand why this is. Is your organisation seen as one that's more vulnerable or easier to commit fraud? And then look, what exactly can we do to change that? Then look at the actual channels and platforms where these cards are being sold. So monitor IRC checking channels, monitor ABC shops for BIN numbers and identification numbers. That'll go a long way to preventing this type of activity and from it getting to the point where people are actually performing cash out operations. Okay, that's all for this week. Thank you, Rose, very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. Have a great week.